A former senior investigator for the January 6th committee is running for U.S. Senate in Missouri. John Wood needs to receive 10,000 signatures by August 1st to be added to the November ballot. He says he has already received thousands of signatures. Wood departed the House Select Committee investigating the Capitol insurrection late last month to launch his campaign. And John Wood joins us now. John, thanks so much for being here. What compelled you to leave your role on this high-profile committee to run for office in an already crowded field?
Much the same reason that led me to work for the January 6th committee in the first place, which is that our country is extremely divided right now, and we need leaders who are going to help unite us and help heal this country. And that's why I went to work for the January 6th committee, and that's what led me to get into this Senate race, because nowhere is that division among American people more evident than in the U.S. Senate race in Missouri, where my party, the Republican Party, appears poised to nominate a disgraced former governor who resigned because he blackmailed his mistress with nude photos, and even after that has been credibly accused by his ex-wife of domestic violence. And on the Democratic side, that's also a race to the bottom, so you can be the most extreme and the most divisive. And I don't think that's what the American people want. I don't think that's what Missouri voters want. We want somebody who's going to help unite us and bring us together.
There's been a third-party attempts in different Senate races before. I think back to Kansas in 2014. What makes you believe an independent candidacy in Missouri this time around can actually be successful?
Yeah, this is really an extraordinary time in general, and in particular in this race. As I was just saying, it looks likely that the Republican nominee is going to be the disgraced former governor who had to resign from office. He appeals to a very small sliver of the Republican primary base, but he's going to do very poorly in a general election. I think that most mainstream conservatives will support me, and Missouri is a very conservative Republican state, so I don't think the Democrat who would inevitably support Chuck Schumer for majority leader would do well either. So I think this is a unique opportunity for an independent or unaffiliated candidate to do well. And I would note, my goal here is not to destroy the two-party system. Instead, I'm trying to transform American politics by sending a message to both parties that the race to the bottom, to be as divisive and as extreme as you can be in order to get a nomination of your party, is not going to work in the general election.
But is Greitens a surefire candidate at this point?
No. He is leading in most of the polls of the Republican field, even after his ex-wife made these under oath allegations of domestic abuse. So I think it's likely he'll be the nominee. But the other leading candidates for the nomination are also engaged in a race to the bottom to try to be as divisive and extreme in an effort to get the primary victory. But I want to send a message that that's not going to work in November.
But why not just jump into the Republican primary if you want to make sure the Republican Party goes in your direction?
Yeah, because I didn't want to play that game. As I said, it seems like all the leading candidates in the Republican primary are in a race to the bottom to be as divisive and as extreme as they can be. And they're doing it for a reason. They're doing it, obviously, because they think that works in a primary where you can appeal to a very small sliver of the base. And I didn't want to engage in that. I want to be a candidate who can help unite Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And so the way to do that is in the general election, where that message is really going to resonate with that, core of probably 80% or so of Missouri voters who reject the extreme left and the extreme right and want someone in the mainstream.
But if you continue with this candidacy, and let's say Greitens is the nominee for the Republicans, won't you have to build a coalition with some of those former candidates from the Republican primary?
Yes, I think that particularly if it's Eric Greitens as the Republican nominee, a lot of the voters in the Republican primary will not find him to be an acceptable alternative. If he wins, whoever wins that Republican primary will probably do so with somewhere around 25% of the vote in the primary. So 3/4 of the people in that Republican primary will have voted for a different candidate. And I think those are voters that I can pick off. And then, of course, there are a lot of people who don't vote in the primary, or maybe independents, or even some moderate Democrats who would support me.
Have you spoken to former Senator Danforth Senator Roy Blunt, who's retiring, about your candidacy and talked him through why you believe they should support you?
Yeah, Senator Danforth is actually the one who inspired me to get into this race. A few months ago, he came out with a poll that showed that a race between a generic Republican, a generic Democrat, and a Republican running as an independent in the mold of a Jack Danforth or a Roy Blunt, that it would be a very close three-way race. And he called on somebody to get into this race in that mold, who would be somebody who's going to help unite Missourians rather than divide us. My first job right out of college was for Senator Danforth. And so I listened to his call for somebody to step up and serve and decided that it was my honor and my obligation to do so. So he's really the reason that I got into this race.
What does Senator Hawley do if it's Greitens versus you for that right side of Missouri?
Now, that's an interesting question. Senator Hawley would have to speak for himself, but he has called for Eric Greitens to get out of the race because he thinks he is unfit to serve in the U.S. Senate. So I don't see how Senator Hawley could say that and then turn around and endorse Eric Greitens. So I would welcome Senator Hawley's support, and I look forward to serving with him in the U.S. Senate to serve the interests of Missouri voters.
Let's talk a bit more about your time on the January 6th committee. What were you seeking to accomplish inside the committee? It's still ongoing. I know you're probably sensitive about talking too much about those private discussions, but let's be blunt here. Is this about trying to compile enough evidence so that the Justice Department can make a full evaluation of whether the former president committed a crime?
It's about compiling all the evidence so the American people can know what happened, because the fundamental goal of the committee is to make sure that something like what happened on January 6th never happens again. And so the hearings have shed a lot of light on that. The release of some excerpts of depositions and some documents has as well. And then ultimately, I think the committee sometime in the fall will come out with a very thorough report that's going to lay out all of the facts as they found them. And I think that will be of great interest to the Justice Department, but that's not the reason the committee is doing it. The committee is doing it so the American people know what happened and that we can take steps to make sure something like that never happens again.
John Wood, thank you.
Thank you, Robert.